Entire towns once stopped working to crown a peasant king for a day. Medieval Europe thrived on a secret calendar of forgotten festivals that dictated the rhythm of life itself. This journey uncovers 26 of these lost celebrations, revealing how they built communities and controlled society from the ground up. You will discover the hidden social rules that governed everything from harvests to holidays, a system where chaos was planned and rebellion was scheduled. We will explore why priests led donkeys into church and why villagers let their fools rule the streets. How much of our own need for celebration is rooted in this ancient pastime itself felt different in the medieval world. It was not a steady march of identical minutes, but a great breathing cycle of seasons. The life of a common person was bound to the soil, a relentless rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting, all under the vast umbrella of the church's year. In this existence of constant toil, festivals were not mere entertainment. They were essential. They were the bright, loud punctuation marks in a long, hard sentence of labor, the officially approved moments when the entire community could exhale. These celebrations offered a vital break for rest, for markets to spring up and goods to be traded, and for young people to meet under the watchful eyes of their neighbors. But they were far more than just a day off. Each festival was a complex social ritual, a tool used to strengthen the bonds of the community and to hammer home the lessons of the faith. And often, if you scratch the surface of a Christian holy day, you would find the bones of a much older pagan tradition, a fusion of beliefs that gave these events a unique and powerful energy. This deep human need to come together, to mark the turning of the year and to momentarily step outside the ordinary, is the very foundation upon which our first forgotten festival was built, a celebration born from the deepest dark of winter. The very pillars of the church seemed to shake with laughter during the Feast of Fools. For a few riotous days around the New Year, the solemn hierarchy of the medieval world was not just ignored but actively mocked. Imagine a young choir boy, barely a teenager, dressed in the lavish robes of a bishop, giving a sermon that was pure nonsense to a congregation howling with glee. Picture the sacred space of the cathedral filled with the braying of a donkey led right up to the altar, its hee-haw standing in for a holy hymn. This was not a protest or a riot, it was an officially permitted event. The lower clergy and even common folk were given a license to ridicule their superiors through parodies of the Mass, wearing masks and singing wildly irreverent songs. Why would the powerful allow such a thing? This controlled chaos acted as a brilliant social pressure valve. It allowed pent-up frustrations and the inherent tensions of a rigidly structured society to be released in a burst of carnival laughter within a strict time limit. By letting people play at rebellion, the system actually reinforced the normal order. Once the feast was over, the mock bishop returned to his humble duties, and the world snapped back into place, perhaps with a renewed, if grudging, acceptance of its rules. This deep need to temporarily flip the world on its head, to let the fool rule the king, was a powerful force that found expression in another, even more widespread festival of inversion. While the clergy reveled in their Feast of Fools, the great halls of the nobility had their own master of festive chaos, the Lord of Misrule. In castles and manor houses across England, a profound transformation occurred for the 12 days of Christmas. A lowly kitchen boy, a humble stable hand, or perhaps the court jester would be ceremonially crowned as the ruler of the entire household. This was no mere costume party. For those 12 days, this mock monarch held genuine, if absurd, authority. He could issue decrees demanding that the duke sing a ballad from the high table, or that the lord of the manor serve the servants their dinner. The entire social pyramid was inverted, and everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest retainer, was expected to play along with the charade. This sanctioned rebellion was a brilliant piece of social engineering. By giving people a taste of a world turned upside down, the tradition made the return to normality on the 12th night feel like a relief rather than a burden. The temporary freedom did not spark a desire for permanent change. Instead, it highlighted the stability and order of everyday life, making it seem more natural and justified. The wild laughter and chaotic games were a container for society's tensions, and when the lid was sealed once more, a quiet acceptance often settled over the hall. This spirit of inversion, so loud and boisterous in the dead of winter, would re-emerge with the first thaw in a far more solemn and mysterious form, a springtime ritual that spoke not of chaos but of death and renewal. The laughter of the Lord of Misrule faded with the winter frost, but the human need for playful rebellion simply found a new season. With the arrival of spring and the solemnity of Easter past, many English villages erupted into the boisterous celebration of Hocktide. This was a festival that turned the entire community into a stage for a playful battle of the sexes. On the second Monday after Easter, known as Hock Monday, the women held the power. They would roam the streets with ropes and ribbons, capturing any man they could find and holding him hostage until he paid a ransom. This was not a serious demand for wealth, but a light-hearted toll, often just a kiss or a single coin. Then, on the very next day, Hock Tuesday, the tables turned completely. Now it was the men's turn to capture the women, who would then have to buy their own freedom. The entire town became a swirling, laughing game of tag, with everyone from young apprentices to respected elders potentially getting caught up in the fun. All the small ransoms collected, what people called hock money, were not pocketed by the captors. Instead, the funds were carefully gathered and donated to the local parish church, making this raucous game a vital source of community fundraising. But the money was almost a secondary benefit. Hocktide's true genius was in how it formally acknowledged the everyday tensions and flirtations between men and women. It gave those dynamics a safe, scheduled, and highly public outlet. For 2 days a year, the normal rules of courtship and social interaction were suspended and replaced with a structured game of pursuit and capture. This allowed the community to laugh at itself, to play with the idea of power and submission, and then to return to everyday life having released that social pressure. The coins collected for the church were a tangible result, but the intangible mending of the community's social fabric was the real prize. This blending of spiritual purpose with deeply human social ritual would reach its most spectacular form in a festival that moved entire cities, a procession that turned faith into a public drama for all to see. While the playful battles of Hocktide echoed through English villages, a far more solemn and peculiar ritual unfolded inside French cathedrals each January 14th. This was the Feast of the Ass, a ceremony that transformed a humble beast of burden into the central figure of worship. The entire congregation would watch in reverent silence as a young woman, representing the Virgin Mary, and a child for the infant Jesus, were led down the main aisle of the church on the back of a donkey. The animal itself was not some ordinary farm creature dragged in from the fields. It was groomed and decorated with magnificent cloth, treated for this one day as the most important guest. The air, thick with incense, would then be broken by a sound we would never associate with a holy service. As the Mass reached its conclusion, the entire church would erupt not with a traditional hymn, but with the braying of a donkey. Every person, from the priest to the poorest peasant, would imitate the animal's call, a chorus of hee-haws rising to the vaulted ceilings. To our modern ears, this seems like pure sacrilege, an act of mockery. But for the medieval mind, it was the exact opposite. This was a profound, deeply felt form of devotion. The congregation was not laughing at the donkey. They were honoring it. They were using this strange, shared sound to physically connect with the biblical story of the Holy Family's desperate flight into Egypt. The braying was an act of empathy, a way to step into the story and feel the hardship, fear, and ultimate salvation of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, who relied on this simple animal for their very survival. For a population that could not read the Bible for themselves, this festival was a powerful, sensory sermon. They could see the woman and child on the donkey's back. They could hear and make the animal's distinctive cry. The story became something they could live and breathe, not just hear. This need to embody faith, to make the divine story tangible through shared, physical ritual, was a cornerstone of medieval life. It was a form of worship that engaged the entire community, body and soul, and it found another powerful expression in a celebration that brought the entire story of the Bible out of the church and into the public square. A miniature bishop in full regalia could command the most powerful cathedral in Europe. On the Feast of Holy Innocents, the day commemorating the children slain by King Herod, the solemnity of the church was softened by a poignant ceremony. A young choir boy, chosen for his voice or his piety, was elected as the boy bishop. He was not merely playing dress-up. For a period that could stretch from December 28th all the way to Epiphany, this child was vested with symbolic authority. He wore meticulously crafted, tiny versions of a bishop's robes, carried a small crozier, and led processions through the streets. The entire community would turn out to watch this small, solemn figure, flanked by his fellow choir boys acting as a miniature cathedral chapter, parade through the town. He would even deliver a sermon, usually penned by a grown-up cleric, from the pulpit and bestow blessings upon the kneeling congregation. This was far more than a charming spectacle or a quaint holiday tradition. It was a profound piece of religious theater designed to humble the powerful. The sight of a child embodying the highest local office served as a direct, visual rebuke to any adult clergy who had grown arrogant or corrupt. It reminded everyone that the qualities most valued in the eyes of their faith were not worldly power or complex theology, but the innocence, humility, and pure faith of a child. For a few days, the entire social and religious hierarchy paused to honor these virtues, making the boy bishop a living, breathing parable that captivated the city. This same impulse to make faith tangible and spectacular would soon burst forth from the cathedral doors and take over the public square in a festival of epic, citywide drama. The echoes of the boy bishop's procession had barely faded when the deep, dark weeks of winter brought an even older festival to the streets of medieval Europe. The Kalends of January was a ghost from the ancient world, a direct descendant of the Roman Saturnalia that clung stubbornly to life 1,000 years later. As the new year approached, the rigid order of medieval society loosened its grip once more. People took to the streets in disguise, not as holy figures, but as wild creatures or members of the opposite sex, their identities hidden behind masks and costumes. The nights were filled with the sound of laughter and song as groups went door to door, not for tricks but for treats and fellowship. These visits were accompanied by the exchange of small, symbolic gifts. A gift of figs or a pot of honey was not just a pleasant gesture. It was a powerful charm, a tangible wish for a sweet and prosperous year to come. The air was thick with well-wishing and the smell of feasts from every home, all meant to ensure fortune would smile on the community in the 12 months ahead. For centuries, the Church fought a relentless war against these practices. Bishops and theologians wrote furious sermons condemning the Kalends as a pagan abomination, a dangerous relic of a defeated empire. They saw the masks as invitations for demons and the revelry as an offense to God, but they were fighting against a current of human tradition too deep to easily divert. People simply would not stop celebrating the turn of the year in this way, so the church did what it so often did when it could not eradicate a popular custom. It began to absorb and repurpose it. The gift-giving was slowly reframed in the context of the Magi presenting gifts to the infant Jesus at Epiphany. The well-wishing for the new year was channeled into church services and blessings. The deep human need for hope and camaraderie at the year's rebirth was too powerful to deny. It was a complex negotiation between old and new beliefs, where pagan rituals were not destroyed but slowly, carefully, woven into the fabric of Christian life. This urban celebration, with its Roman roots and masked processions, was one way to confront the winter dark, but in the countryside, a different, more primal need took hold, one that required not masks but fire. The deep country dark of May Eve was not empty but alive with fire. As the last embers of winter's Kalends festivities faded into memory, a new and more primal blaze ignited across the hills of Scotland, Ireland, and beyond. This was Beltane, a festival that marked the vital transition from the tight, dark security of the village to the wide, open risks of the summer pastures. The entire community's survival now depended on the health of its livestock, and this was not left to chance. On the eve of May 1st, two great bonfires were built, their flames reaching for the sky. Then, in a breathtaking and smoky ritual, the entire herd of cattle was driven directly between these twin pillars of fire. The air would thicken with the scent of burning peat and the lowing of anxious animals, their hides warmed by the intense heat. This was no mere spectacle. It was a powerful act of purification, a living filter of flame meant to sear away any lurking disease or malignant spirit that might sicken the herd in the months to come. Once the animals passed through, the people followed, leaping over the lower flames. Young couples jumped hand in hand, their laughter mixing with the crackle of the fire, each leap a prayer for personal fertility and good fortune in the coming year. Beltane was a perfect, tangible fusion of desperate hope and practical necessity. The magical belief in the purifying power of fire was inextricably linked to the very real need to protect their primary source of wealth, food, and labor. This deep, community-wide investment in the success of the herd reveals just how much was at stake. The entire economic and spiritual life of the village was bound to the land's productivity, a concern that would soon pivot from the pasture to the field, as the success of the herd gave way to the pressing need to secure an even greater prize, the grain harvest that would feed everyone through the next long winter. The scent of Beltane's purifying smoke had long since faded, replaced by the heavy, golden smell of ripe wheat. After the desperate hopes pinned on the herd's health came a celebration tied to an even more fundamental need, the community's daily bread. Lammas Day arrived on the 1st of August, a festival known in every village as Loaf Mass Day. This was not a celebration of wild chaos or inversion, but one of profound gratitude and communal interdependence. The entire cycle of the harvest culminated in a single, powerful symbol, the loaf of bread. On this day, the very first sheaves of the new wheat were carefully threshed, milled, and baked into a special loaf. This was no ordinary bread. It was carried with reverence to the parish church, where the priest would consecrate it upon the altar. This act transformed the simple loaf into a sacred offering, a tangible thank you for the harvest that would sustain the village through the coming winter. It was a public recognition that their survival was a gift, born from both divine grace and backbreaking human labor. But Lammas was far more than a church service. It was the pivot point of the entire rural year, weaving the sacred, the economic, and the agricultural into a single, seamless event. With the hay harvest finished and the first grain safely gathered, the community turned to the practical matters that governed their lives. Lammas Day was a traditional date for settling accounts, when tenants would pay their rents in the form of a portion of the new harvest. It was also the day when hiring fairs sprang up across the countryside. Laborers seeking work for the next season would stand in the market square, their tools in hand, hoping to be hired by a local farmer for the remainder of the harvest. Great fairs erupted, filled with the noise of livestock trading, the buzz of craftsmen selling their wares, and the laughter of games and feasting. In this one celebration, you see the complete medieval world in perfect, if temporary, balance. The sacred loaf on the altar, the rent paid in the manor court, and the laborer hired at the fair were all parts of the same whole, a society acknowledging its reliance on the land and on each other. This harmony, however, was fragile. The very communities that came together so peacefully for Lammas would soon unleash a tradition of sanctioned conflict, where the spirit of playful battle would spill over into a fight for control of the harvest itself. The harmony of Lammas could shatter in an instant with the first clang of a pot. For every celebration that built community through shared joy, there existed another that enforced its rules through fear. This was the Charivari, a ritual of noise and shame that was not marked on any calendar. It waited in the shadows, triggered only when someone in the village broke an unwritten social law. When a marriage caused offense, perhaps because of a vast difference in age or because a widow remarried too quickly for her neighbor's liking, the community did not file a formal complaint. Instead, as darkness fell, a masked crowd would materialize outside the offending couple's home. They came armed not with weapons but with the tools of their kitchens and barns. The night would erupt in a deafening cacophony of banging pots, clattering pans, and the blare of animal horns. This was rough music, a symphony of pure disapproval meant to serenade the inhabitants with their own humiliation. The masks were crucial not just for anonymity, but to transform the participants from neighbors into a single, terrifying embodiment of the village conscience. This was social policing at its most raw and effective. By publicly shaming the couple, the Charivari reinforced the strict boundaries of acceptable behavior for everyone. It was a stark reminder that in a world without a strong police force, the community itself was the ultimate enforcer of its moral code. This dark undercurrent reveals that medieval festivals were not always about unity, but sometimes about unity against someone. The joyous, inclusive celebrations we often picture existed alongside these brutal displays of conformity, where the fear of becoming the next target kept everyone in line. From this chilling chorus of judgment, we turn to a celebration that was its absolute opposite, a festival not of noise but of quiet beauty, where the entire community came together to adorn its very heart with flowers. The sharp sting of social judgment from the Charivari was forgotten with the first warm breezes of spring. A very different kind of gathering would pull the entire village into the woods at dawn. On the 1st of May, the world was reborn in flowers, and every soul was expected to join the procession. They called it bringing in the May. Before the sun had properly risen, young and old alike would stream out of the village gates and into the surrounding forests, their purpose to gather armfuls of nature's new bounty. They returned not with grim purpose but with laughter, carrying hawthorn blossoms, bluebells, and fresh green branches. These were not mere decorations. They were the very essence of life itself, brought back to weave into garlands for doorways and to drape over the village well. The centerpiece of this transformation was the maypole. This was no small garden ornament, but a towering, stripped tree trunk planted firmly in the heart of the village green. From its summit hung long, brightly colored ribbons, each one held by a young dancer. As the music began, a complex pattern unfolded. The dancers, moving in opposite directions, wove the ribbons into a tight, beautiful sheath around the pole, a living metaphor of the community intertwining its lives for the coming season. To lead this day of sanctioned joy, a May king and queen were crowned. These were not nobles, but a young man and woman from the village, chosen for their popularity or perhaps their beauty, to preside over the games and the great feast that followed. The entire day was charged with an energy of courtship and flirtation, a rare and public opportunity for young people to meet and socialize under the approving gaze of the community. This was not an invention of the medieval church. It was a festival with deep pagan roots, a direct celebration of nature's fertility and the powerful, undeniable return of life after the long death of winter. The church, recognizing it could not fight such a powerful, popular joy, often tried to reframe it by dedicating the month to the Virgin Mary. But for the common people, the day remained what it had always been, a profound, physical affirmation of life, community, and the promise of new beginnings. This spirit of joyous renewal, so firmly rooted in the green woods and flowering fields, found a surprising and parallel expression not on land, but in the water, with a festival that honored the rivers and the life they sustained. Even the frozen heart of winter could not stop the flow of life. On the crisp, bright morning of Epiphany, the entire community did not gather inside the warm stone walls of the church. Instead, they processed out into the cold, following their priest in a solemn line toward the nearest river or seashore. The air was so cold their breath hung in clouds, and the water looked dark and forbidding. This was the blessing of the waters, a ceremony that turned the most essential element of life into a sacred spectacle. The priest, raising his voice against the wind, would offer prayers before hurling a heavy, ornate cross into the icy depths. The moment the cross splashed into the water, a group of the town's strongest young men plunged in after it. This was not a leisurely swim, but a desperate, shivering race. The one who managed to seize the cross from the murky bottom and bring it back to the surface was not just a winner of a game. He was a hero for the day, believed to carry a special divine favor that would shield him and his family for the entire year to come. But the blessing was not for him alone. Once the cross was retrieved, the priest would bless the river or the sea itself. The congregation then surged forward, not to swim, but to collect this newly sanctified water in jars and flasks. They carried it home with the utmost care, for this water was now considered a powerful medicine and a shield against evil. A few drops would be sprinkled in the barn to protect the livestock, or used to bless the thresholds of their homes. It was a physical, tangible piece of holiness they could carry back from the ceremony. This festival perfectly demonstrates how medieval faith was woven into the very landscape. It was not an abstract belief confined to a building. It was a belief that a river could be made holy, that divine power could flow through the same water that quenched their thirst and irrigated their fields. It sanctified their entire world, from the grandest cathedral down to the local stream. This profound need to dramatize faith, to make the divine story a public event, would soon inspire a spectacle of an entirely different scale, one that moved from the natural world into the heart of the city itself. The quiet sanctity of the blessing of the waters gave way to the most spectacular public spectacle of the medieval year. In the 13th century, a new festival was born that would come to define urban life, the Feast of Corpus Christi. This was not a quiet observance within church walls, but a city-wide explosion of faith and artistry. On a single day in late spring, the entire town would transform. The procession began with the most sacred object, the consecrated host, which was placed in a magnificent vessel and carried through the streets under a richly embroidered canopy. The town's most powerful citizens, from the mayor to the nobility, would vie for the honor of holding the poles of that canopy, a public display of piety and power. But the real magic happened in the streets themselves. As the holy relic passed, the entire route became a living Bible. The guilds of craftsmen, the butchers, the carpenters, the goldsmiths had spent the entire year preparing for this moment. Each guild was responsible for a specific biblical story, which they performed on rolling stages called pageant wagons. One wagon would depict the creation of the world with elaborate painted backdrops. The next would stage Noah's Ark, complete with live animals peering from the windows. Further down the street, another wagon would present the crucifixion, with actors portraying a sorrowful Mary and a repentant thief. This was theater for everyone, from the illiterate laborer to the learned scholar, making the complex stories of Scripture accessible, vivid, and unforgettable. The entire city became a single, sprawling stage, a testament to communal pride and divine devotion. This grand public theater, however, was built upon a foundation of intense personal belief, a kind of faith that would soon retreat from the noisy streets and seek expression in the deepest, most private corners of the human heart. While the urban feast of Corpus Christi dazzled the senses with color and pageantry, a far more primal drama unfolded in the snowbound villages of the Alps. In the deep of winter, during the ominous 12 nights after Christmas, the streets did not belong to men but to spirits. This was the Perchtenlauf, a terrifying procession meant to confront the darkness head-on. The participants were not actors playing roles, they became vessels for ancient forces. They cloaked themselves in shaggy pelts of fur and straw, transforming their bodies into shambling, beast-like figures. But the true focus of terror was the mask. Each one was a masterpiece of folk horror, carved from dark wood into a grotesque, frozen scream with lolling tongues, twisted horns, and eyes that seemed to hold the long winter night itself. These were the Perchten, spirits caught between benevolence and pure malice, and their arrival was announced by a deafening, chaotic symphony. The air shattered with the relentless clanging of enormous bells strapped to their bodies, a wall of sound meant to stun evil spirits into flight. They did not walk peacefully, but charged and spun through the streets, cracking long whips that sliced through the frozen air. This was not a performance for an audience, it was a communal exorcism. The villagers did not just watch, they participated by opening their homes and their barns to the rampaging Perchten, inviting the chaotic procession to drive out any lingering malevolence from their own hearths and livestock. The sheer terror of the event was its entire purpose. By giving a face and a form to the abstract fears of starvation and eternal cold, the community could physically fight them, using noise and controlled fear to scour the village clean. It was a desperate, powerful bargain with the dark, a ritual of purification through terror to ensure the sun's inevitable return. This starkly protective magic, born from the harsh mountain winter, finds a quieter but equally determined echo in another tradition, one that used not fear, but light to guard the threshold of the new year. The village church stood ready to bless a different kind of congregation. As the last of the spring frost retreated, the air filled not with hymns alone, but with the restless bleating of sheep. This was the shepherd's holy day, a festival that marked the great annual migration to the high summer pastures. The entire community gathered to witness a solemn mass, not for themselves, but for the men and their flocks who were about to vanish into the mountains for months. The priest's prayers were intensely practical, a direct plea to God and the saints to shield these men from wolves, sudden storms, and illness, and to keep their animals fertile and strong. This spiritual send-off was fused with earthy preparation. Families ensured their shepherds were supplied with salt, simple tools, and tough bread for the long isolation ahead. The emotion of the day was a complex blend of celebration and sorrow. Everyone knew the shepherds faced profound loneliness and very real danger, and this ceremony was the community's way of wrapping its collective arms around them one last time. It publicly affirmed that the town's wealth, its very supply of wool, cheese, and meat, depended entirely on the success of this small, departing group. This ritual bound the shepherds to the home they left behind, creating an invisible thread of obligation and care that would stretch across the miles until the flocks returned, fattened, in the autumn. It was a powerful recognition of an occupational identity so crucial that its success demanded a holy day all its own. That same deep connection between a community and its most vital workers would soon be celebrated again, but this time for a harvest pulled not from the land but from the sea. The rhythmic tapping of the shoemaker's hammer was silenced for a day of feasting and pride. On the 25th of October, the air in towns across Europe grew thick with the scent of roasting meat and the sound of boisterous laughter, all emanating from the guild hall of the shoemakers. This was St. Crispin's Day, a celebration that belonged entirely to the cobblers, a festival of occupational identity. The entire guild, from the wealthiest master who supplied nobles with fine leather boots to the humblest apprentice stitching soles, gathered for a grand procession. They marched through the streets not as individuals, but as a unified body, displaying their wealth through lavish banners and the fine clothes they wore, all paid for by a common fund to which every member contributed. This public display was a powerful advertisement of their collective success and importance to the community. After the procession, the feast began, a tangible expression of their solidarity where the guild's leaders would also distribute charity to their older, poorer, or sick members. This was not mere almsgiving, it was a vital, internal support system. In a world with no pensions or unemployment benefits, the guild acted as a private safety net, and this festival reinforced the bonds that made such mutual aid possible. Often, the day would culminate in a play dramatizing the life of Saint Crispin himself, a humble Roman shoemaker who became a martyr. Watching his story, the cobblers saw their own daily labor reflected in a holy light, their craft sanctified, and their place in the divine order affirmed. This intense, guild-focused celebration highlights how medieval society was a patchwork of such occupational communities, each with its own rituals and identity. But this same impulse to build community through shared celebration could also be harnessed for a purpose that united the entire town, not just a single trade, in an act of pure, defiant joy. The cheers of the cobblers on St. Crispin's Day had a very different echo on the archery range. In towns fortified by walls and the constant need for defense, the sharp thwack of an arrow hitting its mark was a sound of civic pride. Each year, the members of the archery guild gathered for a contest of supreme skill, a tournament to elect their own monarch, the king of the archers. This was no casual game. The competitors, often master craftsmen by trade, drew their longbows with the focused intensity of soldiers, because that is precisely what they were expected to be in times of crisis. The man whose arrow flew truest, who consistently struck the small wooden target known as the popinjay, was not just given a prize, he was crowned. For an entire year, this master marksman would be honored as the guild's king, presiding over feasts and marching at the front of every major civic procession, his status visible to all. This festival was a brilliant piece of social engineering. By turning a critical military drill into a public spectacle of honor and reward, the town ensured its men remained proficient with the bow, a weapon vital to national defense. The celebration seamlessly wove the military guild into the fabric of the city, blurring the line between the craftsman at his bench and the soldier on the wall. It was a powerful reminder that every citizen had a duty to protect the community, a duty that could be celebrated with a crown and a grand banquet. This fusion of martial skill and civic identity finds a fascinating parallel in a celebration dedicated not to soldiers, but to the very soil they defended. Even the humble jester had his own guild, a recognized corporation of chaos with written rules and a protected social role. In the bustling cities of Germany and Switzerland, the professional fools and minstrels were not just wandering entertainers. They were organized, forming official fools' guilds with strict statutes and a monopoly on public performance. Their annual carnival was the pinnacle of their art, a spectacle of biting satire performed with complete immunity. Hidden behind their motley costumes and iconic caps with jingling bells, these performers took to the streets and squares to lampoon the most powerful figures in society. They would enact skits mocking a corrupt town councillor, parody a bishop known for his greed, or sing songs detailing the latest local scandal that everyone knew about but no one dared to mention aloud. The crowd would roar with knowing laughter, the shared release of pent-up grievances filling the air. This was licensed criticism, a brilliant and sophisticated safety valve. In an age without a free press or any formal way to hold leaders accountable, the Fool's Carnival gave the common people a voice. It was public opinion made flesh, a way to shame the powerful into better behavior by threatening them with the eternal ridicule of the festival. This was not mindless revelry, it was a masterclass in social commentary, proving that laughter could be a formidable weapon. From this sharp, politically charged celebration, we turn to a festival that served a very different purpose, one focused not on critique, but on pure, unadulterated community joy. Even the hallowed halls of the university could not resist the pull of festive rebellion. In the heart of medieval Paris, the Sorbonne's rigid world of logic and Latin grammar was annually upended by the Grimalia. The students, living under a relentless cycle of lectures, disputations, and strict clerical discipline, seized their moment of freedom by electing one of their own as a boy bishop. This was not a pious ceremony like the one in the cathedral, but a boisterous parody of the entire academic establishment. For several glorious days, this mock bishop, flanked by a student court, would lead processions through the university quarter, turning the sober rituals of scholarship into a carnival of satire. They delivered mock-serious sermons filled with inside jokes and academic gibberish, lampooning their stern professors and the endless, mind-numbing debates over ancient texts. Normal rules were suspended, and the usual hierarchy of master and student was gleefully inverted. This sanctioned chaos was a vital pressure valve for young men trapped in an intense, often oppressive, intellectual environment. It allowed them to blow off steam, to bond with their peers through shared laughter, and to momentarily escape the immense pressure to succeed in a system that promised social mobility but demanded absolute conformity. The Grimalia proves that festival culture was not confined to farmers and craftsmen. It permeated every layer of society, providing a structured outlet for rebellion even for the most educated minds. This urban, intellectual celebration of inversion stands in stark contrast to the festival that bloomed next, one that was deeply rooted not in books but in the very soil of the countryside. The weight of a kingdom made of flowers rested on the shoulders of a village couple. While many towns celebrated May Day with a general crown for a king and queen, some English villages held a far more specific and physically demanding ritual, the ceremony of the Garland king and queen. This was not a simple coronation with a wreath of hawthorn. The centerpiece was an immense, bell-adorned structure, a conical frame that could be as tall as a man, meticulously covered in every flower and green leaf the community could gather. This heavy, fragrant bower was then hoisted onto the shoulders of the chosen Garland king, who processed through the streets with his queen by his side, completely encased in this moving garden. With every step he took, the hundreds of small bells sewn into the garland would ring out, a shower of sound announcing the arrival of spring's royalty. The entire village followed this living, breathing spectacle, their laughter and music blending with the constant, cheerful chiming. This was far more than a parade. It was a powerful act of sympathetic magic. By placing a human couple at the very heart of this symbol of nature's abundance, the community was performing a desperate, hopeful prayer. The health and fertility of the king and queen, their visible joy and vitality, were believed to directly influence the health and fertility of their crops, their livestock, and by extension, every person in the village. They were not just representing the idea of spring, they were personally responsible for channeling its life-giving force into the world. This ritual often coincided with the ancient practice of well-dressing, where the village water sources were decorated with intricate pictures made from flower petals and moss. Together, these ceremonies honored the two most essential elements for life, water and the fertile earth, binding them together through human representatives. The Garland king and queen carried the hopes of the entire community, a beautiful, fragrant, and incredibly heavy burden of responsibility. This deep-seated belief in the power of human symbols to protect and nourish a community would soon manifest in a much darker, more defensive ritual, one designed not to encourage growth but to ward off its destruction. The midsummer sun reached its zenith and then, in a paradox of light, began its slow surrender to the dark. On the eve of St. John the Baptist's feast, the 23rd of June, a different kind of sun was kindled across the hills and valleys of Europe. These were the St. John's fires, great beacons that answered the daylight with their own earthly flame. As dusk fell, entire communities gathered around these roaring pyres, their faces glowing in the orange light. The celebration was not one of mere observation, but of direct physical participation. One by one, and often in pairs, people would take a running start and leap straight through the flames. This was not a daredevil stunt, but a profound act of faith and magic. Each jump was a prayer for purification, a belief that the fire could burn away sickness and misfortune, ensuring robust health for the year ahead. Young lovers would leap hand in hand, their flight through the fire a public wish for a fertile and prosperous union, but the power of the fire was not meant to be contained. Once the bonfire was blazing at its peak, villagers would light torches from its heart and carry these embers out into the growing darkness. They ran along the boundaries of their fields, tracing the precious crops with arcs of fire, a blessing meant to encourage growth and protect the grain from blight. They carried the flames to their barns and homes, using the smoke to cleanse their animals and their living spaces from any lurking evil. Even the ashes that remained the next morning held potent magic. They were carefully gathered and scattered over the soil, believed to be a powerful fertilizer that carried the sun's vitality directly into the earth. Why was this single night charged with such power? It was a perfect fusion of three powerful traditions. The Christian calendar provided the date, honoring the saint who was a burning and shining light. Underneath that was a deep, pagan layer of solar worship, acknowledging the summer solstice, the peak of the sun's strength. And woven through it all was a tangible, practical magic, a belief that fire could cleanse, protect, and nourish. It was a night when witches and dragons, the embodiment of chaos and ruin, were thought to roam, and the community's united front of fire was their only defense. This brilliant, fiery celebration of the sun at its most powerful stands in stark contrast to the festival that followed, a quieter, more reflective observance that would mark the sun's gradual decline into the long nights of autumn. That final sheaf of wheat standing alone in a vast, empty field was never just leftover stalks. It was watched with a mixture of reverence and fear, for the community believed it held a captive spirit. This was the moment of the harvest home, the festival that sealed the annual contract between the people and the land. The last patch of grain was not carelessly cut down. Instead, the reapers would take turns throwing their sickles at it from a distance, or the youngest girl present would be given the honor of the final cut. This was a delicate operation, for they had to capture the spirit, not kill it. The sheaf was then carefully woven into a human-like figure, a corn dolly or kern baby, dressed in a tiny skirt and apron. This doll was not a trophy. It was a vessel, the new home for the spirit of the grain, which had fled from stalk to stalk as the harvest progressed and was now trapped in this last sacred bundle. To carry the kern baby to the harvest supper was to carry the very soul of the next year's harvest in your arms. The entire community would process behind it, singing traditional songs, their relief and exhaustion giving way to a profound, superstitious hope. The feast that followed, often called the Mel Supper, was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The long tables groaned with food, and the lord of the manor was expected to provide this meal for his laborers, a tangible acknowledgement of their back-breaking work. For one night, the strict lines between master and servant blurred in a shared celebration of survival, but the ritual was not over when the last bite was eaten. The corn dolly was not discarded. It was kept safe through the winter, often hung from a kitchen beam or placed in the barn, a protective talisman guarding the spirit of the crop until it could be returned to the first plowed field in the spring. This was a perfect cyclical view of time, where the end of one harvest was literally the seed of the next. This deep connection to the land's eternal cycle would soon find a parallel expression, not in the golden fields of grain, but in the shadowy, unpredictable world of the forest, where communities sought to secure a different kind of bounty. The chill of early January still gripped the English village, but the real work of the year was about to begin. On the first Monday after Epiphany, a procession unlike any other wound its way through the muddy streets. It was not led by priests or nobles, but by teams of farm laborers, their faces set with purpose as they dragged a heavy, decorated plow from door to door. This was Plow Monday, the official start of the agricultural year, and the men who would spend the next 12 months behind that plow were now in command. They would stop at every household, especially the more prosperous ones, and demand a payment not in coin but in good cheer, a coin for the church fund or, most commonly, a jug of ale. This was not a polite request, it was a ritual demand backed by a potent, playful threat. If a householder was stingy and refused to contribute, the men might not just move on. They would put their shoulders to the beams and with great ceremony plow a deep, messy furrow right across the offender's doorstep, a public mark of shame that would be talked about for weeks. This seemingly rowdy behavior was, in fact, a deeply layered tradition. The money collected, often called plow money, was a vital fundraiser for the parish church, specifically to keep a special candle, the plow light, burning before the altar. This eternal flame was a continuous prayer for the fertility of the land that the plow would soon tear open, so the ritual was three things at once. It was a practical collection for a sacred cause, a symbolic blessing of the village's most important tool, and a stark, physical reminder to every member of the community that their collective survival depended entirely on the success of these men and their plow. The furrow at the doorstep was more than a prank, it was a lesson. It showed what happened when cooperation failed, when the social contract that bound the wealthy householder to the humble plowman was broken. This intricate blend of superstition, charity, and blunt economics reveals how deeply the rhythm of the soil governed every aspect of medieval life. The creak of the city gate and the steady tramp of boots on cobblestones were sounds of profound reassurance. In towns throughout medieval Europe, the annual inspection of walls, weapons, and the citizen watch was far more than a bureaucratic chore. It was the vibrant heart of the watch and ward pageants. This was the day when civic duty transformed into a spectacular festival of identity and independence. The entire town would turn out to watch the watchmen themselves parade in their finest gear, their polished helmets and halberds glinting in the sun. But this was not a grim military review. The air filled with the sounds of mock battles staged on the town green, where local guildsmen, playing the parts of heroic defenders, would drive off actors dressed as comical invaders to the roaring approval of the crowd. The history of the town itself was brought to life in rolling pageants, with wagons depicting the founding legend, the miracles of the patron saint, or great victories from the past. Why turn a defense drill into a public holiday? It was a masterclass in civic psychology. By wrapping the sober responsibility of collective security in the thrilling cloak of theater and celebration, the town leaders ensured everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest apprentice, felt a personal stake in their home's survival. The festival wove a powerful narrative that each citizen was a thread in the town's protective fabric, their shared vigilance the only thing standing between their thriving world and the chaos outside the walls. This powerful, outward-looking celebration of communal strength would soon find its counterpoint in a journey that was deeply personal and introspective, a festival that moved not through city streets, but across the landscape of the soul. The parish boundary was a line scratched not on any map, but directly onto the earth by the feet of the faithful. For 3 consecutive days before Ascension Day, the entire community would fall into step behind their priest for the Rogation processions. This was not a joyous, flower-strewn parade, but a solemn, purposeful march, a public prayer on the move. The priest, clad in his vestments, led the way, chanting litanies and psalms begging for divine favor. He asked for protection from late frosts and summer blight, for just enough rain and sun to secure the harvest that would determine their survival. The congregation followed, their voices rising and falling in a unified murmur that drifted over the fields they were blessing. But prayer was only half of the ritual. In their hands, many carried long, supple willow wands. As the procession reached a significant marker, a particular ancient oak tree, a prominent stone, or a bend in a stream, they did not simply note its location. They beat it. The willow wands would swish through the air, striking the boundary stone or lashing the trunk of the tree. This act of beating the bounds seems bizarre to us now, an act of violence against the landscape. Yet it was a profound and practical act of communal memory. In a world where written deeds were rare and accurate maps were non-existent, the physical memory of the body was the most reliable record. The sting of the willow branch in a young boy's hand, the sound of it cracking against the granite stone, the very ache in his arm from the effort, all served to sear the precise location of the parish limit into his mind. He would carry that memory for life, and one day he would ensure his own son learned the same lesson in the same way. This ritual was a living archive, a way to prevent costly and bitter land disputes with neighboring parishes by creating a dozen living witnesses who knew the exact line in the soil. Rogation wove together the spiritual, the social, and the territorial into a single, powerful cord. It sanctified the very land the people lived on, turning their physical home into a sacred space defined by faith and walked by the community. This deep, intensely local connection to a specific patch of earth stands in sharp contrast to the next festival, a celebration that reached beyond every local boundary to embrace the entire known world. The parish boundary, so carefully beaten into memory during Rogation, felt porous and thin on the eve of All Souls. The line between the living and the dead was believed to dissolve entirely on the 2nd of November. This was the Feast of All Souls, a day that transformed every home into a sacred space of memory and hope. Its medieval character was profoundly different from the quiet church services of today. It was a vibrant, tangible belief that the souls of the departed, currently undergoing purification in purgatory, were granted a temporary return to their earthly homes. Families prepared for this visit with meticulous care. As darkness fell, an extra place was set at the dinner table, a silent invitation to a lost parent, a child, or a spouse. A plate of food was left out, and the hearth fire was kept burning brightly through the night, a beacon of warmth and welcome in the cold autumn dark. This was not a fearful vigil, but a tender, communal act of love. The living sought to comfort the dead, offering them a final, symbolic share in the comforts of the home they had left behind. This intercession extended beyond the family hearth. Special soul cakes were baked, simple spiced currant buns marked with a cross. These were not kept, but given freely to the poor who went door to door, singing and offering prayers for the household's departed loved ones. This created a beautiful, cyclical economy of grace. The living gave physical sustenance to the poor, and in return, the poor offered spiritual sustenance through their prayers, which were believed to help shorten the soul's time in purgatory. The entire community, from the wealthiest family to the most destitute beggar, was thus woven into a single network of care that stretched across the veil of death itself. This festival reinforced a bond so powerful it shaped the medieval world's entire spiritual outlook. The dead were not gone, they were merely waiting, and it was the duty of the living to help them on their journey. This intimate, hopeful relationship with the departed, built on food, fire, and prayer, sets the stage for our final, most mysterious and unsettling festival. A single sheet left hanging on a clothesline could summon a spectral army from the sky. The most haunting celebration was not a feast or a procession, but a pervasive dread that transformed the dark winter winds into a terrifying omen. This was the legend of the Wild Hunt, a phantom cavalcade said to ride the storm clouds during the long, ominous 12 nights after Christmas. Its arrival was heralded by a supernatural roar, a cacophony of baying hounds, blaring horns, and the furious galloping of ghostly horses. Leading this army of the dead could be any number of mythical figures, from the Norse god Odin on his 8-legged steed to the heroic King Arthur awakened from his slumber, or even a local nobleman cursed for his sins to lead the hunt for eternity. To see this terrifying procession was to witness a direct portent of catastrophe. Its passage across the night sky foretold coming war, famine, or a plague that would sweep through the village. This was not a story told for entertainment. It was a deeply held belief that dictated behavior. On nights when the wind howled with a particular menace, families would bar their shutters and bring any wandering livestock inside. They knew to leave offerings of bread or salt on their doorstep, a desperate bribe to appease the restless spirits and encourage them to pass by. And crucially, not a single piece of laundry was left on the line, for it was believed the hunt would snatch the linens, cursing the household or even stealing the soul of the person who owned them. This pervasive fear served as a powerful, invisible form of social control. It enforced taboos and proper conduct during the most spiritually vulnerable time of the year, explaining the terrifying fury of winter storms as something more than just weather. The Wild Hunt was the dark counterpart to the year's joyous festivals, a necessary shadow that gave the brighter celebrations their meaning. It was the medieval mind's way of giving a name and a shape to its deepest fears, completing the great breathing cycle of the year with a final, chilling acknowledgement of the chaos that always lurked just beyond the firelight. The frantic energy of the Wild Hunt fades, leaving us with a profound stillness. After this journey through 26 forgotten celebrations, the chaotic calendar of feasts and fires reveals a hidden order. These festivals were not mere diversions, they were the essential social technology that held medieval society together. They functioned as a complex, self-regulating system, a kind of communal clockwork that managed the pressures of a difficult and rigid world. Time itself was not a blank slate, but a structured cycle of labor and release dictated by these events. They enforced the community's unwritten rules, not only through the joyful approval of a May Day crowd, but also through the terrifying judgment of the Charivari's rough music. Economically, they were vital engines, creating the temporary markets of Lammas and the hiring fairs that redistributed labor and goods. Psychologically, they offered a sanctioned escape, a pressure valve for the frustrations of peasant life through the glorious inversions of the Feast of Fools or the Lord of Misrule. The sacred and the secular were not separate spheres, but intricately woven together in events like the Blessing of the Waters, where faith made the local river holy. The individual found their place within the larger whole, whether as the humble shoemaker on St. Crispin's Day or the chosen Garland king carrying the weight of the community's hope. Even the boundary between the living and the dead dissolved during All Souls, creating a single, continuous community across the veil of death. These festivals created a coherent worldview, a way for people to understand their place in the universe, from the soil under their feet to the storm clouds overhead. They were the mechanisms of resilience, allowing society to adapt, to find meaning in toil, and to reaffirm its bonds not just through shared work, but through shared joy, shared fear, and shared remembrance. This legacy asks a quiet question of our own time. In an age of fragmented communities and digital connection, what are the modern rituals that bind us together, and what parts of our own humanity might we be forgetting to celebrate? A world without these festivals would have been a world without its heartbeat. From the riotous laughter of the Feast of Fools to the solemn processions of Rogation, these 26 forgotten celebrations reveal a medieval society pulsating with ritual and meaning. Our ancestors understood the human need for celebration, for release, and for communal bonding in ways we have perhaps forgotten in our modern, individualized world. These were not random parties, they were the fundamental social technology that glued communities together. They shaped identities, with the shoemaker feeling a profound pride on St. Crispin's Day and the archer earning his crown. They powered economies, creating the temporary markets of Lammas and the hiring fairs that set the rhythm of labor for the year ahead. The very fabric of society was woven in village squares around bonfires and in the shared stories performed on pageant wagons. This journey reminds us that culture is not built solely in grand courts and cathedrals, but in the everyday spaces where people come together to mark their time on earth. They found a way to make sense of their world, to endure its hardships, and to celebrate its fleeting joys through a calendar they created together. As we close this chapter on the past, it leaves us with a quiet question. What are the modern rituals that truly bind our own communities today? Which of these forgotten traditions resonates most deeply with you? Share your thoughts on these lost celebrations in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this journey into the hidden corners of history, be sure to subscribe for more.